Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of On the Podium. My name's Kumbar, and in this week's episode, we're going to be going over the Australian GP. I would have gotten this episode out sooner. I got COVID, so it is what it is. I guess I'm still recovering. I'm still a little slow, a little brain fogged. I guess it's the only way from here is up, unless you're Orlando, which is there is down. But I'm trying not to think like that, which is also hilarious to see considering the way he's been rather depressive about the performance of McLaren. I guess because he had such high hopes as well in the way that the team performed and the phenomenal season that he had last year, the Aussie GP. It was overall a pretty mid race. I'm not going to lie, compared to the overtakes and the drama of the last couple races, it was all right. I mean, they could have definitely added that last DRS for sure, considering how many trains there were. It's not like that race didn't have overtakes or, it's not like it lacked complete excitement, but like the two bangers that we had for races, just the first two in Jeddah and Bahrain, but overall, definitely some interesting things happened for sure. Starting off with Checo, Papa Petron just getting dicked by Verstappen while he was trying to go on the outside there. He definitely had to compromise. He was going to go in. Hamilton definitely decided to go on the inside of that turn, had to get pushed out, lost that place, and then spent some time going back and trying to make that place up again. And then, Sainz, I don't understand the tire strategy that Ferrari decided to put him on. Very questionable, to be honest, putting him on a hard tire, trying to make up places. To me, that doesn't make sense. You want a softer tire, relatively speaking, and trying to make up those places right away. Everybody knows how long it takes to get those hard tires switched on. And even if you have tire warmers, even if, have a little less time sitting still, it's going to take some time, and it's not exactly the opportune tire for him to get up to speed on. On top of that, considering that he had issues with his steering wheel and then he had issues with the anti-stall system in his car, he dropped 5 places. I was just perplexed by that. Obviously there's some error input from him. There's some from the team. The 17 consecutive points track record just being demolished by what happened afterwards, was really surprising, considering that he had done so well. There's been multiple occasions where, even in times where he's taken grid penalties before because of an engine change. It was frustrating being a Sainz fan. It was pretty disappointing to say the least. Him and Checo are, like I've said before in my last podcast, they're definitely two of my favorites. So, it was nice to see at least one, shining and coming up to, fulfilling expectations for Red Bull like no other teammate has before, not since at least Ricardo. Going on to McLaren for the weekend overall, even qualifying, at least they look somewhat competitive considering McLaren's first 2 races were just disastrous. They had the porpoising problem relatively solved compared to, say, Mercedes or even Aston. But regardless of the package that they have right now, it just doesn't look good. Andreas Seidel, McLaren's team principal, brought up, to quote him exactly, the intensive work we had to do after experiencing the current problems cost us some resources that we would have liked to use for performance development. There definitely have been on the back foot. I guess the way that the circuit is in terms of having higher speed and more medium speed corners relatively to the other racetracks that they've raced at, they look like they did all right. The way that it's looking right now, considering that haven't been able to solve exactly what the issues are with the car and I guess the overall package, it's going to be really dependent from track to track relatively to, some other cars like, say, Red Bull or Ferrari who have it figured out. We know that Red Bull has that straight line speed, and then, Ferrari's the excellent package that's able to create the downforce that they need in those slow speed corners. Going back to Ferrari as well, their porpoising was so erratic. It looked like they were on springs that belonged on a off-roader. The only other car that I saw relatively to them was Mercedes porpoising through it. You could see it in quali. You could see it through the straights during the race. Absolutely atrocious. I don't even understand how Charles was able to even drive, considering how much he was bouncing up and down. But regardless of that, that car's been performing phenomenally. So I guess them running closer to the ground is paying off more dividends, and Charles is able to handle those undulations that happen in the car while he's driving. But, it was just really interesting to see because they had so much pace in the car considering that was happening. And speaking on Red Bull, their pace compared to Mercedes was incredible. I mean, even though Checo had to make up that place that he'd lost from the start, he went on the outside without DRS to take over Hamilton to gain that place back. I mean, that was pretty damn incredible for him to do. But unfortunately, that Red Bull was just chewing up those tires. Like they were blistering, seeing graining well before the Ferrari, even compared to, say, a Williams that was just cruising along on hards right to the end. But I guess it's just down to their overall aero package that they brought and developed. I know Checo, I guess, had an easier time. He had some different upgrades compared to Verstappen, which we still don't know exactly why one had it and the other didn't. It could have been that they were only able to make one, or that they just wanted to see if that new part facilitated more gains in terms of performance relatively to what the setup is right now for the car. But I guess we'll have to wait and see. I mean, Checo did do a really good job, and he was able to keep relative pace, but he was still quite a bit far off. Granted, of course, he was fighting Russell for quite a bit of time. Charles was able to pull a monster gap, I mean, of over 7 seconds in the first quarter of the race, but that Ferrari was just cruising throughout the entire race. It is absolutely incredible, considering that they still have 0.4 seconds of pace potentially to unlock as well. They haven't had any upgrades yet. That is just crazy. And I came across some tweets actually from Fanatics Ferrari, and I didn't know that they brought Michael Schumacher's championship winning designer back, Rory Byrne, who definitely played a pivotal role in making a championship winning car. According to them, I mean, back in 2020, Mattia brought out the South African designer out of retirement to help engineer and design that Ferrari. And we've seen how incredible it is, despite, the porpoising issues that it's having, and maybe not the fastest car in a straight line, but it's still been able to outperform every other car on the grid by a wide margin. The one thing that I noticed, though, was an addition of another variable that hasn't been applicable to seasons prior was the tire temperature differences, considering that the tire warming blankets have been knocked lower. I believe they're both 70 degrees now, front and back. Drivers have to take more time to switch them on. I guess they have to compensate a lot more, considering the tires won't be up to temperature. And then even in terms of strategy, teams overall have to take that into consideration as well. But it's great to see another variable added to the race. It adds another layer of unpredictability that, makes the race a lot more interesting. And it'll be really interesting to see, though, actually, to think about it now, is when they take away those tire blankets entirely, which I think is going to be happening in the next couple of years. Can you imagine wet weather races without tire warming blankets? Like, that's going to be pretty crazy. I'm not going to lie. But yeah, I think more variables, the better. I think even the fact that cars are able to pass each other so much easier than they were before because of the new regulations. It's something that Charles said. It's like you have to be a much more clever driver. You have to understand, it's not being the fastest driver. It's being a lot more calculated in your decisions. And of course, there's an entire team behind that driver. There's an entire faculty of people trying to figure out how many variables involved. We saw that in the past couple of races where you had to time it so well. It even came down to last season when Verstappen held back, waited to get DRS going behind Mick Schumacher, gaining that DRS advantage, and then going in for that pass later on over Hamilton. And now you're seeing that a lot more often, albeit this race pretty much had none at the front of the pack. A relatively static race considering there were 3 DRS zones. And I mean, something that Christian talked about as well. Maybe they should have added that 4th one. There are quite a few DRS trains and people were stuck behind. It kind of looked like the races of old. But, I'm not complaining. It could have always been worse. It was relatively not that bad of a race, though. But I mean, it was also crazy to see how many safety cars there were. 2 full safety cars and then a virtual safety car as well. Unfortunately, pretty sad to see Seb crash out. Everyone thought that his car just had stopped working, considering the mechanics were up till God knows how long trying to figure out what's wrong with the car and trying to put it back together. He had his helmet off right up until the last 5 minutes of quali and just put a quick lap in. He hasn't raced, for the past few races. I mean, Hülkenberg's been filling in that seat for him. And then, him just absolutely bottling it through a corner, losing that front wing, spinning around, and then just, limping back to a corner. It's kind of sad to see that situation for Seb. I guess the stars didn't align for Seb in this situation, considering the mighty domineering car that Ferrari's been able to conjure up with these new regulations, although it wasn't likely considering how early he was released. And, I guess he lost his confidence and the culture that Ferrari is known for, which is, let's say, not the warmest all the time. Maybe some of that passion facilitates a bit of toxicity. It's hard to say, to be honest. He left when he didn't need to leave. But to think that Seb didn't get the car that's as competitive as it is now, you can't help but feel sorry for him. I mean, his entire dream was to be like Mike, other Mike, not NBA Mike, but he wanted to be his idol. I mean, he won 4 world titles with Red Bull, and then he had runner-ups in the Ferrari, and he really tried. I think that last run that he had in 2018, it was a good run nonetheless. Yeah, I'm just hoping that Aston's able to get their stuff figured out. It's bonkers just to try to figure out what happened. Like, they've ascended from a small underdog team, their owner being caught for fraud, the team almost collapsing, being sold, and then turning around into a formidable team. Otmar Safnauer really brought, I think, the team to a good place. I mean, they're almost P3 in the Constructors' Championship had it not been for some penalty points, which is huge. Beating out McLaren and Alpine and Ferrari. I mean, Ferrari had their moment, but I mean, still. And then been on the downward spiral from last season with some rule changes they had regarding the rear side floor of the car. But I mean, God help them. They're burning so much cash. So many people are leaving as well. Who knows? I mean, Mike Craxton, but it doesn't seem to be doing a whole lot. It's just going to be really interesting to see. I know that a lot of the original management that's been at the team for a very long time has departed, of course, because they haven't been happy with the extreme expansion that they've had. It's almost like they just spread themselves too thin right away, or maybe they haven't got the right talent. They've been pouring in that cash, hundreds of millions of dollars, of course, with new facilities and new hiring changes. I'm pretty much at loss for words. Lance did have, I guess, a decent finish to the race at 12th, but nowhere near where they have been. And disappointing to see Haas at the back of the midfield again, considering how well they've done in the last 2 races. Mick, relatively did well, I guess, considering that he finished out on top ahead of Kevin Magnussen. But Gunter was saying that there was some issues with their setup, the balance of the car. There's such a drastic change. I'll walk back on that a little bit, actually. McLaren hadn't made any changes to the car, so I guess it was just the suitability of the track, which highlights the flaws of the Haas as it is, considering that it might just have certain proclivities towards certain racetracks to do well at. But, hopefully they're able to figure out what the issues are and make some gains for the rest of the year because, surprisingly, Alfa Romeo hasn't had those same issues that Haas has had. I mean, Valtteri coming out with pretty decent points. So, it looks like that Alfa's doing okay. Of course, Zhou Guan Yu, he's a rookie finishing in, at 11th, which is really good just outside the points. So, he's definitely showing some promise as well. And again, the overall package that Alfa Romeo has been able to bring, it's not only a good looking car, but a pretty good performing car as well. But speaking of well-performing cars or anything but a well-performing car has been that Red Bull, at least in terms of reliability, because last year it was pretty well bulletproof, but this year it doesn't have that Honda Civic reliability. Like 2 DNFs in 3 races. Verstappen's just deflated, publicly making a statement that he's just does not expect to be defending a title this year. A rather pessimistic view, that's for sure, but it's perplexing. It's difficult to understand how they've stepped back considering how good of a car that they have had. But, now that I think about it as well, it might have been the same issue that Alpine is having as well, because, Alpine's has had to retire the car as well. Funny enough, speaking of retirement, when Alonso was on that blistering quali lap, going in purple sectors compared to Charles, which was mind-boggling to say the least. An Alpine going up against a Ferrari in quali, Jesus. I guess that's a testament to Fernando's driving. But, funny enough, it was a $1 oil ring that caused, probably few $100,000 in damages to that car. But you know what? I did find it funny, though, actually going back to Red Bull, when Checo was asking his race engineer, he's like, don't worry about it. It's not our problem. You know, which was actually, I guess, a bit of a relief, considering that it was an isolated problem and it hopefully wouldn't have affected Checo, because had it done that, Red Bull would have really dropped behind then. And I mean, things would be looking extremely grim, considering that both cars were out of contention multiple times so far this early in the season. And reliability issues like that, I'd imagine quite a bit of an overhaul to figure out, because it's not just like small gremlins that you can just fix up right away. Alpine has tried to extract a lot more performance for the sake of reliability, and maybe Red Bull's done the same. I know that E10 fuel's been of an issue. It's definitely interesting to see. Maybe it is because of that, and maybe it's not. But hopefully they're able to figure that out. Otherwise, they're going to have a very difficult campaign coming up ahead. But going back to, you know, Stroll, Gasly, and Valtteri, I mean, not bad races by those guys. Overall, pretty good. I know that they were fighting quite a bit in the midfield. But yeah, it was just crazy to see how many drivers went often just cutting that grass like they're landscapers. Like, I guess it was that new tarmac. You know, new tarmacs are slippery, relatively speaking, to ones that have been rubbered in quite a bit for grippier racing. And touching back to Alonso, what a poor race for him. I mean, that guy had absolutely no luck. I mean, relative to Esteban Ocon, whose pace was, you know, decent, I guess. The only reason I'm saying decent, though, is because Alex Albon in the Williams was 4 seconds ahead of him on average in tires that were basically used for almost the entire race. I think this is that strategy that they had just wasn't working for him, and it just wasn't clicking after that quality lap. I think that just whatever the issues that they were having hadn't been resolved, and I think that it was just interesting to see just how diverse the outcome was for Alonso and Ocon in that case, and on to comparing teammates as well. I mean, a cracking job by George Russell as well. I mean, he did get lucky with that safety car, but I mean, he held his own compared to Lewis Hamilton. I mean, 7-time world champion Sir Lewis Hamilton. And I just really found it funny that the team's like, yeah, we're not going to swap you. During the race, it came up on the screen, quoting him directly, "You guys put me in a really difficult position." I feel like Lewis felt like he was just dicked. I like the fact that Mercedes, isn't playing favorites right away. I guess if things were a little bit more contentious, but right now they're just both letting them race. And good on Russell to keep enough of a gap where Mercedes didn't want to warrant team orders. But I mean, I bet that burnt a little bit. He's been off the pace of the past few races, but I mean, it's good to see that George is actually living up to the expectations that a lot of people have had for him. I guess considering that he's had input on the development of the car as well, so it's not totally catered to the way that Lewis would want it. That definitely works an advantage in terms of his timing coming into that seat. I mean, we knew he could drive as well, considering what he's able to do when he had to step in for Lewis when he had COVID a couple of seasons ago. But regardless of that, yeah, I mean, bravo to Russ for doing a job as well as he did. Moving on from a former Williams driver to a current Williams driver, going back to Albon. I mean, Jesus Christ. For as long as he did keeping those tires alive, that was incredible. I mean, in a Williams, whose car has just been, to be frank, just trash. And squeezing a points finish coming out in P10. I mean, even he was expecting, being in the back of the pack again, but I guess the strategy worked out in their favor. And I mean, this has to be a career highlight for them. He managed those tires as well as Checo has. The memes have been going around, and I'll sneak one in there for you guys as well to see, but just crazy for him to be able to pull that off. And hats off to him. And I mean, something that Sam Collins talked about on a old Tech Talk preseason as well. I mean, that Williams has some aero trickery going on to it that other teams don't have, and it's a package that definitely is yet to be unlocked. Not to be another guy that hammers on Latifi, but I mean, I don't expect him to unlock that from the car. But I mean, if Albon's able to do that, and maybe that's a glimmer of hope that he is, we might see Williams climb the ladder as the season progresses. The more that he learns and becomes more comfortable with the way that the car is and has a better understanding of how to get that car set up, things could look promising for him, and he might be able to really redeem himself considering his performances when he was at Red Bull. And I mean, rounding off at least just the Aussie GP, like the position that Carlos has put himself in, just, going out on lap 3 like the way he did, that's going to put him in a really difficult position. I have a lot of faith in Carlos. I mean, I always root for, the underdog. I mean, he's always been talked about as being an underrated driver. I tweeted this before as well. I think he's definitely a late bloomer. He had his time at Red Bull and Renault and really started, I think, coming to form when he was at McLaren with Lando a couple seasons ago. And he's really showing, very promising characteristics of what could be a championship winning driver. But I think once things click for him, I think that's where it'll be. But right now, as the way that it is, he's really relegating himself to being a number 2 driver, very similar to a Valtteri and a Lewis or a Sebastian Vettel and a Mark Webber situation where he's just deemed to be that number 2 driver. I really hope that he's able to turn around, especially for the next race and the coming races as well. My hope is that he's finally able to figure things out and really becomes in sync the way with the car is. I understand that, Charles is considered the wonder boy of Ferrari, comparable to Verstappen, and he's really come to form as well. But I'm really hoping Carlos really stays on the trajectory that he's been on, which is not coming out of talent like the other 2 that I just mentioned, but incremental improvements that he's consistently made throughout the seasons. And I think once it clicks for him, it'll click, and it'll click really well. Having an extremely comparable drive to Charles, despite coming into that car for the very first year, it goes to show that he definitely has the cojones to do a really good job in that car. And I really hope he does it, because considering that Checo is able to put the car on pole the weekend prior, it'll be really interesting to see how things work out for the supposed number 2 drivers of the 2 top teams right now. Although it doesn't really look like Red Bull is a top team if you're to look at the scoreboard without context. But yeah, it'll really be interesting to see how the 2 teams are able to perform in the coming races. That's kind of that for the Aussie GP. But on a side note, I definitely wanted to finish off on a couple of things as well. Some updates that I thought were pretty important and that I've spoken on in the last episode as well, with the VW group entering. And so far, I feel like I'm pretty much on the ball for the most part in terms of at least where I think things are moving. Is definitely looking like it's pretty definitive. Of course, everything is going to come down to the wire with the new engine changes that are going to come in 2026. There's a lot of things to take into consideration as well. I'm going to be imagining that Porsche is going to be aligning with Red Bull. I mean, they've had extremely strong interest as well. The race talked about it. Both Porsche and Red Bull on also alphatauri are aligned with Mobil 1 for oil and fuel supply. The question is, I think, is coming down to where Audi is going to be positioning themselves within Formula 1 as well. Of course, they're not going to be taking on an entirely solo project coming in as a constructor, because obviously that's not financially feasible for them, considering that VW Group has potentially 2 manufacturers going in. So to have their own engine project and a full-on constructor project, it doesn't definitely make sense. But where they're going to land is definitely going to be interesting. Of course, I know Williams is wanting to distance itself from Mercedes, wanting to become more independent like they were in the past, like when it was BMW Williams, or even thinking about it now when there was BMW Sauber as well. You could see a departure, because I know that the Swiss outfit Sauber Engineering, or as we know, Alfa Romeo, flying under that banner, they're not exactly particularly happy and want more independence from Ferrari, considering that they did not want another Ferrari driver in their lineup. So you have those 2 teams lined up. And there was talks of McLaren as well, and there's even talks of Aston Martin. I don't think it would be the right fit. I know that there's been talks of Audi ponying up $500 million to take out, or buy out, I should say, McLaren entirely. But I don't see that happening, considering, I guess, the financial backing that they've been able to accumulate through loans and investments. And then also Aston Martin as well. Like, there's talks of that, but I don't see that happening either with them, because Toto has a 5% share in Aston Martin. Of course, I don't know if he's going to be liquidating that if things were to change. I know Aston wants to segregate itself from Mercedes. There's been talks of that for quite some time now, and Lawrence has the money to just blow on that as well. But we'll have to kind of wait and see how that works out, because to take on that project by themselves just wouldn't make sense, because the undertaking would be just so financially exhausting. And considering that they don't have a previous IP to work off of or anything like that, it'll definitely be interesting to see how that works out for them. But going back to where I might go with Audi. I could definitely see something like a Sauber Audi partnership, but I think it'll be really great to see a lot more diversity as well with engine manufacturers and different partnerships as well. And speaking of having more, I really would like another American team. I mean, overall, it would make sense for F1 to have another American team besides Haas. You know, there were speculations of Haas being bought out by Andretti, but of course that didn't make sense. And then those talks with Sauber Engineering and the Andretti Autosport team fell through. But, you know, they've had now backing from McLaren, so it would be amazing to see them. And also to mention that they've had backing from Alpine as well. So it'd be really cool to see if they are able to make an entrance, maybe with, you know, new changes coming in 2026 with the engines. And hopefully they're maybe able to garner more favor with the rest of the teams. Of course, nobody wants to, or no team wants to split their earnings from the big pot that they get from F1. But I'm trying to remain optimistic regarding that. I mean, it just makes sense. 3 races in America. You also include the race in Canada and Mexico and Brazil. There's a lot of races in time zones that people will watch, and having another American team and possibly another American driver, someone like Colton Herta out of IndyCar making an appearance. I mean, he's already on the McLaren F1 development team, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. But that's it for me today, guys. Thanks again for joining me on the podium. Make sure you hit the like button, comment, subscribe. Hit me up on Twitter. I'm going to be posting a lot more on Instagram and a lot more on TikTok. We can keep the conversation going on there. Take care, guys. Have a good one.